Dark Secrets of the Kenyan Presidency. Chapter 1, The Old Man Who Stopped Drinking. The early 50s were a time of unprecedented turmoil and violence in colonial Kenya. The wind of change that was sweeping across much of Africa did not spare this previously peaceful terrain. Many people even at the time suspected quite rightly that these were the birth pangs prior to the birth of a new order, a different Kenya. And this included those who did not want to imagine in their worst nightmare a government run by the natives, as they called them. Violent struggle has happened in Kenya many times through its short history, but it has never worked out too well or even proved to be that effective. The events that took place at around the time of the state of emergency being declared in 1952 saw many Kenyans lose their lives, but the uprising was successfully defeated by the colonial government and the country went back to life as it was before the Troubles. It must have been really sad, because it looked like all those who had all died in vain. Probably the most dramatic death at the time was the hanging of Field Marshal Dedan Kimathi at Kamatai Maximum Security Prison. Ironically, he had been caught because he was betrayed by one of his very own. More recently, the Saba Saba riots that hit the country during the 1990s clamor for multipartyism were quickly crashed by Moi security forces. In both cases, the deaths served to attract more attention from the international community, who exerted more pressure for the change that inevitably came. Thank God that all those gallant patriotic Kenyans did not die in vain after all. Still, the point I am trying to emphasize is that many Kenyans cling to the mirage that our independence was won from a violent freedom struggle. Very romantic, but unfortunately it is not quite true. Yes, the gallant Mau Mau warriors spread terror in everybody. Indeed, they even inspired others in faraway lands, most notably Nelson Mandela in South Africa, and this led to the formation of the armed wing of the ANC. You have all heard of the Umkhonto we Sizwe, Spear of the Nation. Indeed, the influence of the Mau Mau spread as far away as to the streets of New York, where at least one notoriously violent street gang called itself the Mau Mau. But back home in Kenya, it was ineffective in winning independence for Kenya. The Mau Mau Uprising reached its height in 1952 and was quickly crushed, mainly because it was about one tribe's fight for their land rights. Actually, the Kikuyu were joined by a handful of other neighboring tribes like the Merus, but the truth is that it was not a widespread popular movement as some people would have us believe. By the time the leader of the Mau Mau, Dedan Kimathi, faced the gallows on February 18, 1957, the Kikuyu uprising had been well and truly defeated. The statistics of the Mau Mau struggle casualties are even more emphatic in illustrating this point. The Mau Mau rebels killed over 2,000 African Kenyan civilians, but killed only 32 European settlers and fewer than 200 British soldiers during the 8 years of the uprising. The British in turn killed 20,000 Mau Mau rebels in combat, hanged over 1,000 suspected Mau Mau supporters, and interned more than 70,000 Kikuyu civilians, including the likes of J.M. Kariuki, 4 years in brutal detention camps, on suspicion of having provided material support for the uprising. Actually, some researchers say that the true number of Kikuyus who were held or detained during that period was closer to 1 million. The man who was to later become Kenya's first president, Jomo Kenyatta, always had a frosty relationship with the Mau Mau. This is contrary to popular opinion. In fact, the Mau Mau even threatened his life on several occasions. It was rather ironic that he ended up on trial trying to prove to a compromised court his innocence in not being involved with the Mau Mau. Kenyatta was not only accused of being a member but of being one of its leaders. The only word that could come close to describing such an allegation against Kenyatta is preposterous. If the charges had not been that serious, even Jomo himself would have found that charge a big joke. And you will too when we dig deeper into the true character of Kenya's first president. The chief witness in that sham of a trial, Rawson Macharia, admitted only in recent years that he had been bribed into giving false evidence against Kenyatta. Admittedly, secret movements are prone to this kind of thing where it becomes easy for wild allegations to be made to stick. Try and think of the dread Monkiki group today. If some stranger were to be suddenly accused of being its leader, it would be impossible for anybody to discount or challenge it. What had built up such hatred towards Kenyatta amongst the powerful in the colonial government? One clue can be found in the fact that Kenyatta firmly believed in tradition and African customs like female circumcision. This is hardly surprising because Jomo was brought up by a traditional medicine man, as we shall see shortly. Anyway, this disgusted many in the colonial administration and may have been the reason why he became a marked man by the whites, whatever he did or said. It is recorded that Kenyatta took part in a public debate in Kikuyu in 1935 over the issue of female circumcision, the Irua of girls. Kenyatta passionately argued in favor of the brutal custom being retained against the likes of Louis Leakey. But Kenyatta was never a violent man at heart and did not believe in violent means, and yet when he became president, he worked hard to glorify the Mau Mau as the chief freedom fighters of Kenya and always emphasized that independence was won with a violent resistance, and he was at the center of it himself, repeating the lies that landed him in jail. In a way, he was insinuating that the colonials had rightly charged him with being leader of the Mau Mau. He was telling the Kenyan people that he had been part of a violent struggle that had landed him in jail, where he had suffered for many years for the sake of the people. What a wonderful story, albeit a pure fairy tale. But it was the kind of thing that gave the old man just the right kind of image to tower like a giant well above any other politician in the country. It is the same image he retains in the eyes of many younger Kenyans who still greatly admire him as a man who fought violently for what he believed in. It was all part of a very deliberate effort to lift the office of the presidency to a pedestal that Kenyans would look up to, one that nobody would dare challenge. Compromise candidate. It is important to appreciate the circumstances under which Jomo Kenyatta ended up as the first president of Kenya. This is important because to date every single man who has ended up as president of Kenya has done so as a compromise candidate. We wait to see what will happen in 2012, but in all likelihood history will duplicate itself once again. In the run-up to independence, Jomo Kenyatta was rotting away in detention without a hope of ever getting back into politics. The white settler government officials swore in public over and over again that that would never happen. The two front-runners for president then were Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, father of ODM leader Raila Odinga, who firmly believed that he should be president by virtue of his age, over the other front-runner Tom Mboya, who was barely in his 20s. Sensing defeat from his crafty young opponent, Odinga decided to fix his main opponent politically by demanding the release of the forgotten Jomo Kenyatta. That decision set in motion a chain of events that handed over the presidency on a silver platter to Kenyatta. When he was receiving the instruments of power on June 1963, Kenyatta still looked dazed and unbelieving. You can watch the videos for yourself on YouTube. Like he wanted to pinch himself to convince himself that he was not dreaming and that all these wonderful things were suddenly happening to him after years of struggle and very hard times which had been set off by false accusations against him in 1952 that put him in jail. Kenyatta's words on that day perfectly capture the mood and his personal feelings. He did not start by saying that it was a great day for Kenyans. Instead he said, "Today is the happiest day of my life." Bizarre tale of witchcraft. But there is another bizarre story often told in whispers that claims that Kenyatta was ordained to be a leader long before the 1950s started to unfold. It is a tale so far out and strange that I cannot resist telling it. It all has to do with one of Kenyatta's wives, Grace Wanjiku, who died whilst giving birth in 1950 to her daughter Jane Wambui, who survived. Kenyatta had married her in 1946 and she was the daughter of Senior Chief Koinange, a collaborator with the colonial government, and sister to Mbia Koinange, who later became a lifelong confidant and was one of the most powerful politicians during Kenyatta's presidency. It is whispered that Wanjiku was actually sacrificed in a witchcraft ceremony in return for Kenyatta getting into leadership of Kenya. The story goes that this was a secret that Kenyatta shared with his brother-in-law Mbiakoin Ange. And this was the reason why they were always so close. Many people don't know it, but Kenyatta was very superstitious and believed firmly in many traditional beliefs despite years of Western schooling. One of the reasons for this is that he was actually brought up by a witch doctor. Kenyatta was born Mau Mugai to parents Mugai and Wamboi in the village of Uranus, Gatendu, Kiambu, but his father died when Jomo was very young, after which, as per Kikuyu custom, he was adopted by his uncle Njengai, who also inherited his mother as his wife. But tragedy struck yet again and his mother died while giving birth. The young Jomo then moved from Ngienda to Muthiga to live with his medicine man grandfather Kungu Wa Magana. Magana was a very famous witch doctor of the time. The two are said to have become very close. It is no accident that in later years Kenyatta called his son with Britain wife, Edna Clark, Peter Magana. He was born in August 11, 1943. And so the story goes that Jomo was told very early, when he was still a child, by his witch doctor grandfather that he was going to be a very famous leader. I am not a superstitious man and the witchcraft story is virtually impossible to verify, but this knowledge of him being destined to be a great leader seems to be confirmed by many of his actions, including the launching of his Kikuyu newspaper. It was strange because although it was clear that Kenyatta was fighting for something, he was too much of a moderate and was almost apologetic as he went about this business of liberation. Little wonder that the then extremely sensitive colonial government tolerated the newspaper that he briefly published from May 1928 called Mwigwithania, since they found it mostly harmless. The Kikuyu Weekly, whose name meant the reconciler. Whatever you may think about this far-out tale of witchcraft and Kenyatta, there is no denying that in many respects the man was an unlikely first president of Kenya for anybody who knew his character well. I find it necessary to reproduce here this speech that Kenyatta made in July 26, 1952 at a Nyeri recruitment meeting for KOW, about 3 months before his arrest on the night of October 20, 1952. The meeting did not go too well. One reason was the traditional rivalry that Kikuyus hailing from Nyeri have always had with those from Kiambu. In addition, Nyeri was a Mau Mau stronghold where there was plenty of sympathy for the terror group which was born in the district. They considered Kiambu Kikuyus, including Kenyatta, collaborators with the Mzungwan cowards. It is apparent that several times during the speech Kenyatta had to urge the crowd to keep quiet and listen to what he had to say. The speech is very revealing. It is also instructive that immediately after this meeting Kenyatta received yet another death threat from the Mau Mau. Here is the speech. I want you to know the purpose of the Kenya African Union, KAU. It is the biggest purpose the African has. It involves every African in Kenya and it is their mouthpiece which asks for freedom. KAU is you and you are the KAU. If we unite now, each and every one of us, and each tribe to another, we will cause the implementation in this country of that which the European calls democracy. True democracy has no color distinction. It does not choose between black and white. We are here in this tremendous gathering under the KAU flag to find which road leads us from darkness into democracy. In order to find it, we Africans must first achieve the right to elect our own representatives. That is surely the first principle of democracy. We are the only race in Kenya which does not elect its own representatives in the legislature, and we are going to set about to rectify this situation. We feel we are dominated by a handful of others who refuse to be just. God said this is our land. Land in which we are to flourish as a people. We are not worried that other races are here with us in our country. But we insist that we are the leaders here, and what we want we insist we get. We want our cattle to get fat on our land so that our children grow up in prosperity. We do not want that fat removed to feed others. He who has ears should now hear that Kau claims this land as its own gift from God, and I wish those who are black, white, or brown at this meeting to know this. Kau speaks in daylight. He who calls us the Mau Mau is not truthful. We do not know this thing Mau Mau. We want to prosper as a nation. And as a nation we demand equality, that is equal pay for equal work. Whether it is a chief, headman, or laborer, he needs in these days increased salary. He needs a salary that compares with the salary of a European who does equal work. We will never get our freedom unless we succeed in this issue. We do not want equal pay for equal work tomorrow, we want it right now. Those who profess to be just must realize that this is the foundation of justice. It has never been known in history that a country prospers without equality. We despise bribery and corruption. Those two words that the European repeatedly refers to. Bribery and corruption is prevalent in this country. But I am not surprised. As long as a people are held down, corruption is sure to rise, and the only answer to this is a policy of equality. If we work together as one, we must succeed. Our country today is in a bad state, for its land is full of fools, and fools in a country delay the independence of its people. Kau seeks to remedy this situation, and I tell you now it despises thieving, robbery, and murder, for these practices ruin our country. I say this because if one man steals, or two men steal, there are people sitting close by lapping up information, who say the whole tribe is bad because a theft has been committed. Those people are wrecking our chances of advancement. They will prevent us getting freedom. If I have my own way, let me tell you, I would butcher the criminal. And there are more criminals than one, in more senses than one. The policeman must arrest an offender. A man who is purely an offender, but he must not go about picking up people with a small horn of liquor in their hands, and march them in procession with his fellow policemen to government and say he has got a Mau Mau amongst the Kikuyu people. The plain-clothes man who hides in the hedges must, I demand, get the truth of our words before he flies to government to present them with false information. I ask this of them who are in the meeting to take heed of my words and do their work properly and justly. Do not be scared of the few policemen under those trees who are holding their rifles high in the air for you to see. Their job is to seize criminals, and we shall save them a duty today. I will never ask you to be subversive, but I ask you to be united. For the day of independence is the day of complete unity, and if we unite completely tomorrow, our independence will come tomorrow. This is the day for you to work hard for your country. It is not words but deeds that count, and the deeds I ask for come from your pockets. The biggest subscribers to KAU are in this order. First, Thompson's Falls branch, second, Elbergen branch, and third, Gatendub branch. Do you, in Nyeri branch, want to beat them? Then let us see your deeds come forth. I want to touch on a number of points, and I ask you for the 100th time to keep quiet whilst I do this. We want self-government. But this we will never get if we drink beer. It is harming our country and making people fools and encouraging crime. It is also taking all our money. Prosperity is a prerequisite of independence and, more important, the beer we are drinking is harmful to our birth rate. You sleep with a woman for nothing if you drink beer. It causes your bones to weaken, and if you want to increase the population of the Kikuyu you must stop drinking. KAU is not a fighting union that uses fists and weapons. If any of you here think that force is good, I do not agree with you. Remember the old saying that he who is hit with a rungu returns, but he who is bit with justice never comes back. I do not want people to accuse us falsely, that we steal and that we are Mau Mau. I pray to you that we join hands for freedom, and freedom means abolishing criminality. Beer harms us, and those who drink it do us harm, and they may be the so-called Mau Mau. Whatever grievances we have, let us air them here in the open. The criminal does not want freedom and land, he wants to line his own pocket. Let us therefore demand our rights justly. The British government has discussed the land problem in Kenya, and we hope to have a royal commission to this country to look into the land problem very shortly. When this royal commission comes, let us show it that we are a good peaceful people and not thieves and robbers." End of speech. It is important to remember that by the time he was making this speech, Jomo was already 58 years old. His exact year of birth was never known, so he could have been slightly older or younger. For all intents and purposes he was already an old man. The truth is that people mellow at this age and start to look at the world very differently and more tolerantly. He had stopped taking alcohol in 1920, 32 years earlier, and announced his decision before witnesses. Actually, he was accused by the church of two sinful crimes, namely marrying without church rites and drinking liquor. He pleaded guilty to both and solemnly promised to reform. He was further ordered to get married before a European magistrate. The strict church then finally accepted him back in 1923, after about 3 years of carefully observing him, and in being accepted back at a ceremony, Jomo promised to refrain from liquor for the rest of his life. It would appear that his life looked up considerably after he stopped taking alcohol. For instance, he turned part of his Dagoretti home into a provision shop which he called Kenyatta store. Then in 1922 he went on to secure a job at SHS 250 per month, an absolute fortune in those days when a blanket cost less than 50 cents, as stores clerk and water meter reader with Nairobi Municipal Council, where John Cook, who was his protege at the church, was water superintendent. The colonials considered Kikuyus thieves and murderers in those days. And this kind of profiling prevented many of them from getting jobs that required very trustworthy people like a store's clerk or meter reader. There is little doubt that the only reason Kenyatta got this opportunity was because of the influence of John Cook and his link with the church at Thagato for a long time. Kenyatta bought a motorbike and also built a house at Dagoretti in the same year, 1922. He went on to start an active role in politics by becoming a member of the Kikuyu Central Association in the same year. Interestingly, the meter reading job exposed Kenyatta considerably, and he met many Asians who would later be key allies and supporters, including the owner of the printing press who went on to print his newspaper, Mwigwithania. With this kind of background, it is not surprising that in the speech I carried earlier in this chapter, he spoke out so strongly against the taking of alcohol. So the question we must busy ourselves with answering now is how this meek old man of the church turned into the feared president everybody wants to remember. Young folks change all the time, but Kenyatta was at least 68 years old when he became Kenya's first prime minister. How does such an old man change from what he has been all his life? That is a mystery that we must solve in this book. In the next chapter we will look at the early bloody years of the Jomo administration. Stay tuned.